After walking away from a grueling career, I bought my dream beach house to finally find some peace. On the very first night, my phone rang. It was my mother. She casually announced that they had sold their house and were moving into mine the next morning because my father decided it was the most practical step. I simply froze. She even had the nerve to add that if I did not like having my family move in, I could pack up and find somewhere else to live. My hands shook as I held the phone, but a cold smile slowly spread across my face. They thought they had completely cornered me. I prepared a devastating surprise for their arrival. My name is Cassidy, and I am 33 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who tried to take advantage of your hard work. For the past 10 years, my entire existence was consumed by Wall Street. I worked as a senior financial risk analyst for one of the most demanding investment firms in New York City. My job was to dig through complex corporate structures, identify hidden financial landmines, and mitigate massive disasters before they could destroy portfolios. It was a world of high-stakes aggressive negotiations and relentless pressure. I spent my 20s dissecting corporate fraud and untangling sophisticated financial schemes. I worked 80 to 90 hours a week surviving on lukewarm coffee and sheer adrenaline. I was exceptionally good at what I did, but the corporate grind took a severe toll on my physical and mental health. I was burning out rapidly. My family, however, never seemed to notice my exhaustion. Whenever we spoke, my parents only cared about the size of my annual bonus or what prestigious clients I had recently acquired. They saw my career purely as a status symbol and a financial safety net for the family, completely ignoring the crushing anxiety that came with it. A few months ago, I reached my absolute breaking point. I sat in my sterile office staring at another endless spreadsheet and realized that no amount of money was worth sacrificing my sanity. I needed a drastic change. I needed a sanctuary where I could finally breathe. So I submitted my resignation, packed up my life in the city, and began searching for a place to heal. I found my perfect escape in Hilton Head, South Carolina. It was a stunning beachfront property that cost me $1.2 million, paid for entirely with the savings I had scraped together over a decade of brutal work. The house was everything I had ever dreamed of. It featured 5 spacious bedrooms, soaring ceilings, massive windows that let in natural light, and a beautiful wraparound deck. Best of all, it had a private wooden walkway that led directly down to the pristine white sand and the crashing waves of the Atlantic Ocean. Moving day was chaotic, but as evening approached, the movers finally left. I was left alone in my beautiful new home. I unpacked the last few essential boxes in the master bedroom, which offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the water. I poured myself a glass of red wine and stepped out onto the balcony. The sensory experience was overwhelming in the best possible way. The air smelled strongly of sea salt and pine trees. The rhythmic sound of the ocean waves hitting the shore washed over me completely, drowning out the lingering echoes of the trading floor and city traffic. For the first time in 10 long years, my shoulders dropped. I closed my eyes and let the cool evening breeze brush against my face. I had finally found my peace. I was safe, completely independent, and miles away from anyone else's demands. That profound tranquility lasted exactly 2 hours. I was sitting on the living room sofa enjoying the quiet when my cell phone vibrated on the coffee table. The screen illuminated the dark room, displaying my mother's name, Brenda. A familiar knot of tension formed in my stomach. My mother rarely called just to check on my well-being. Her calls always came with an agenda. Taking a deep breath, I answered the phone, forcing my voice to sound cheerful and relaxed. I told her I had just settled into the new house and was looking forward to a quiet week of unpacking. Brenda did not offer congratulations. She did not ask how the drive was or if I liked the neighborhood. Instead, her voice came through the speaker sharp and hurried. She said she had some major news. Before I could even ask what it was, she bluntly announced that she and my father Gary had sold their house back home. She said it happened very quickly, and they had to vacate the premises immediately. I felt a sudden spike of confusion asking her where they were going to stay while they looked for a new place. Her response completely paralyzed me. She said they were not looking for a new place. She stated in a tone that brokered no argument that they had already packed the moving truck and were currently driving down the coast. They would be arriving at my house in Hilton Head by tomorrow morning. Your father decided it is the most practical step, she explained smoothly. You have a massive 5-bedroom house all to yourself, Cassidy. It makes perfect sense for us to move in with you. Why waste money on a hotel when family can stay together? I gripped the phone tightly, my mind racing to process the sheer audacity of her statement. They had not asked. They had not discussed this with me. They had simply decided to invade the sanctuary I had literally just purchased. I found my voice telling her firmly that this was not a family vacation home. I told her I bought this house to recover from burnout and that I could not handle having people move in indefinitely. My mother let out a harsh, condescending laugh that grated against my ears. You are a 33-year-old single woman, Cassidy, she scolded. Keeping a massive luxury home entirely to yourself is incredibly selfish. We are your parents. We are moving in tomorrow. If you do not like having your family around, you can pack your bags and find somewhere else to live. The line went dead. She had hung up on me. I stood alone in my beautiful, quiet living room, completely paralyzed by the brazen entitlement. They genuinely believed they could just march in and claim my home as their own. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, but the panic quickly dissolved into something much colder. My Wall Street survival instincts, the very skills I used to dismantle hostile corporate takeovers, instantly kicked in. I looked at my dark phone screen and a slow smile crept across my face. They thought they were moving into a free family resort. They had no idea they were walking straight into a meticulously planned trap. The sheer entitlement of my mother's words echoed through the empty hallways of my new home. You can pack your bags and find somewhere else to live. She delivered the ultimatum with the casual cruelty of someone who never faced a consequence for her actions. Brenda did not ask for permission. She never had. To her, my independence was not an achievement to be celebrated. It was an offensive display of defiance. Her gaslighting was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. By framing my hard-earned success as selfishness, she attempted to flip the script. I was a 33-year-old single woman who had sacrificed my youth to secure a financial future. Yet in her twisted logic, owning a home without a husband justified commandeering my property. I stared out at the dark horizon, the ocean breeze feeling sharp. I replayed her dictatorial tone. There was no request, no gentle inquiry about my boundaries, just a cold command. She expected me to shrink back into the obedient daughter, who always absorbed the collateral damage of our family's dysfunction. She expected me to surrender my sanctuary just as I had surrendered everything else. That phrase kept repeating in my mind. If you do not like it, you can find somewhere else to live. It was the exact same threat she used 15 years ago. The memory hit me with the force of a physical blow, pulling me back to a time when I was completely powerless. I was 18 years old, standing in the cramped kitchen of my childhood home. Just weeks before leaving for college, I had worked myself to the bone, waitressing double shifts and studying late. I had secured a partial academic scholarship and saved enough tip money to cover the remaining tuition for my freshman year. I was finally going to escape. But that afternoon, the atmosphere in the house was thick with panic. My younger sister Ashley sat at the kitchen table sobbing into her hands. She was undeniably the golden child. While I was expected to earn my keep, Ashley was showered with allowances and endless praise. My parents, Gary and Brenda, paced the floor like caged animals. The secret had just come out. Ashley had stolen our father's identity to open multiple high-limit credit cards. She had spent the entire summer living a fantasy life, buying designer handbags and eating at 5-star restaurants. The debt she had accumulated was staggering. It was enough to trigger a fraud investigation that could end with Ashley facing severe criminal charges. The credit card companies were demanding immediate payment. Instead of holding Ashley accountable, my parents turned their desperate eyes toward me. I will never forget the look on my father's face when he cornered me against the kitchen counter. Gary used intimidation as his primary parenting tool. He did not ask for my help, he demanded it. He pointed at the folder holding my college savings and told me that family protects family. Brenda stood right beside him, her voice dripping with that same manipulative poison she used tonight. She told me I was being selfish for wanting to go to an expensive university when my sister was facing jail time. She said I could go to community college, that I was smart enough to figure it out, but Ashley was fragile and needed to be saved. They told me if I did not withdraw my entire scholarship fund and savings to pay off Ashley's debt, I could pack my bags and find somewhere else to live. They threatened to kick me out onto the street if I did not sacrifice my future for her mistakes. I was just a terrified 18-year-old kid with nowhere else to go. I broke down in tears and handed over the folder. The next morning, I walked into the bank with my father standing menacingly over my shoulder. I withdrew every single dollar I had bled for and watched him transfer it to cover the massive debts of his golden child. Ashley did not even thank me. She just complained that her credit score was ruined. That day cemented my role in the family hierarchy. Ashley was the untouchable princess who could do no wrong, and I was the designated financial safety net expected to absorb their reckless choices. Emptying my account had devastating consequences. I lost my spot in the dorms. I had to take out predatory student loans just to pay for my classes. I worked grueling hours in college, functioning on zero sleep, constantly stressed about money. That desperation pushed me into the ruthless world of Wall Street. I chose financial risk analysis because I swore to myself I would never be powerless again. I spent a decade mitigating financial disasters because my family had robbed me of a normal start in life. Now, 15 years later, history was attempting to repeat itself. Brenda and Gary were once again demanding that I hand over the fruits of my labor to accommodate their sudden chaotic needs. They saw my beautiful beach house not as a symbol of my hard work, but as an asset they were entitled to consume. They assumed the 33-year-old woman standing in this luxury home was the same frightened teenager crying in their linoleum kitchen. They truly thought they could force me into submission with a single phone call. I walked away from the glass door and poured the rest of my wine into the sink. My hands had completely stopped shaking. The lingering anxiety from my corporate job had vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating focus. I was no longer a defenseless teenager. I was a seasoned expert in identifying threats, analyzing vulnerabilities, and executing ruthless countermeasures. My parents and my sister thought they had outsmarted me. They thought they were marching into a beachfront paradise where they could resume their reign of emotional and financial terror. As I opened my laptop to lay the groundwork for retaliation, I knew they were making the biggest mistake of their lives. I stared at the dark screen of my laptop, the faint hum of the ocean breeze outside grounding me. Brenda thought she had the final word by hanging up on me. She wanted me left in a state of anxious paralysis, wondering how I would cope with their sudden invasion. I picked up my phone and dialed her number. She answered on the second ring with a smug silence, fully expecting me to beg, cry, or plead for mercy. Instead, I let a heavy, suffocating silence stretch between us for 5 long seconds. When I finally spoke, my voice carried absolutely no emotion. I delivered a chillingly calm, "I will see you tomorrow." I ended the call before she could process the shift. There would be no tears tonight. Crying was a useless expenditure of energy, and my years on Wall Street had trained me to view emotional outbursts as liabilities. I was a risk analyst. When faced with a hostile takeover, you do not panic. You assess the vulnerabilities, fortify your assets, and prepare to dismantle the threat piece by piece. I glanced at the clock on my kitchen wall. It was nearly midnight, but corporate emergencies do not respect business hours. I scrolled through my encrypted contacts and dialed Harrison. He was my private wealth attorney, a ruthless legal mind who had navigated me through the complex process of hiding my identity and assets when purchasing this property. He answered with a groggy, confused voice, clearly startled by the late-night intrusion. I did not apologize for waking him. I told him we had a critical security breach, and I needed immediate clarification on South Carolina property laws. Harrison quickly shook off his sleep, his legal mind snapping to attention. I detailed my family arriving tomorrow and their brazen assumption that they could establish residency in my home. We spent 45 minutes reviewing the exact wording of the deed. I had intentionally purchased this estate under a blind LLC, registering it as a commercial corporate retreat rather than a standard residential property. I needed Harrison to confirm every loophole regarding squatter rights and trespassing statutes. He assured me that because of the commercial designation, typical residential protections would not apply. They would not be tenants. Legally speaking, they would be unauthorized occupants of a commercial enterprise. Harrison promised to have emergency injunction documents drafted and ready the moment I gave the signal. I thanked him, ended the call, and moved to the next phase of my protocol. With the legal perimeter secured, I needed to fortify the physical environment. Before leaving New York, I had purchased a comprehensive suite of high-grade covert security cameras. My original intention was simply to monitor the property while I traveled, but now this equipment would serve a much more aggressive purpose. I retrieved the heavy steel lockbox from my home office and began unpacking the microscopic lenses and audio receivers. For the next 3 hours, I moved through the silent house like a shadow, systematically mapping out overlapping fields of view. I placed a microcamera inside the ornate molding of the living room ceiling, covering the front entryway and main seating area. I embedded another lens within the kitchen smoke detector housing, capturing the island where family disputes inevitably occurred. I wired audio sensors behind the decorative wall sconces in the main hallways. Every common area and gathering space was now under total surveillance. I routed all the feeds directly to a secure encrypted cloud server that only I could access. I was creating an inescapable panopticon. If they intended to manipulate or threaten me in my own home, I would have pristine, undeniable high-definition evidence of every transgression. I carefully tested each angle using my tablet, adjusting the focal points to capture faces and hands with perfect clarity. I ensured there were zero blind spots in the living room and kitchen. The cameras were designed for corporate espionage, equipped with infrared night vision and advanced motion tracking. My parents and my sister would walk through these halls believing they held all the power, completely unaware that their every whisper, every sneer, and every plotted scheme would be digitally archived. I was transforming my sanctuary into a controlled environment where their toxic behavior would become their own undoing. With the physical surveillance active, I sat back down at my heavy wooden desk to execute the most critical part of my defense: the digital trap. I knew my brother-in-law Jamal would be hunting for a reliable internet connection the second he walked through the door. I logged into my primary router and completely partitioned the network. I created a visible, unsecured guest network specifically designed to lure them in, naming it with the default router title to avoid suspicion. Beneath the surface of this guest network, I deployed deep packet inspection tracking software. This was not a simple browsing history log. It was a sophisticated intercept program used by financial institutions to monitor insider trading. Every keystroke, every unencrypted password, every financial transaction, and every hidden email sent through that wireless connection would be intercepted, duplicated, and routed directly to my secure server. Jamal liked to portray himself as a brilliant tech entrepreneur, but I knew he was sloppy. He would connect his devices without a second thought, effectively handing me the keys to his entire fraudulent empire. I watched the progress bars on my screen hit 100%. The security cameras were fully online. The legal framework was entirely solid. The digital network snare was perfectly set and running flawlessly. I closed my laptop carefully and stood up slowly, looking around the quiet, pristine house I had bought with my own blood and sweat. I was no longer the accommodating daughter frantically preparing to welcome her toxic family. I was the warden standing firmly in the center of a meticulously crafted, inescapable prison, calmly waiting for the incoming inmates to arrive and seal their own fate. The morning sun had barely crested over the Atlantic Ocean when the heavy grinding roar of a commercial diesel engine shattered the coastal tranquility. I stood by the kitchen island nursing a mug of black coffee and watched through the floor-to-ceiling windows as a massive 20-foot moving truck labored up my pristine gravel driveway. Its air brakes hissed loudly, crushing the meticulously raked stones. The abrasive noise felt like a physical violation of the peace I had fought so hard to secure. I did not move toward the front door. I simply stood my ground, taking a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the cool weight of absolute control settle into my bones. The heavy passenger doors of the truck swung open. My father Gary was the first to step out onto the crushed gravel. He did not look like a man who had just lost his home. He puffed out his chest, placed his hands on his hips, and surveyed my $1.2 million property with the proprietary gaze of a conquering king inspecting his newly acquired territory. He nodded approvingly at the landscaping, entirely convinced that his status as the patriarch gave him automatic dominion over my hard-earned assets. My mother Brenda emerged seconds later. She adjusted her oversized sunglasses and immediately began pointing at my carefully curated flower beds, her face twisted in a familiar mask of disapproval. Before she even crossed the threshold, she was already finding things to criticize, loudly complaining to my father that the hydrangeas looked cheap and planning how she would completely redesign the garden to suit her own superior tastes. Neither of them looked toward the house to see if I was waiting. They simply expected me to fall into line, ready to serve them. But as I watched them march toward my front porch, the rear doors of the accompanying luxury SUV swung open. A cold spike of genuine shock hit my chest. They were not alone. My younger sister Ashley stepped out of the vehicle. She stretched her arms wearing a pristine white tennis outfit that she had likely bought on credit just for this trip. She looked up at the massive beachfront house and squealed with delight, treating my private sanctuary like a free luxury resort booked exclusively for her entertainment. She had not worked a full day in her life, yet she looked at my home with the greedy entitlement of someone claiming her rightful inheritance. Then the driver's side door opened and the final piece of this toxic puzzle emerged. It was Ashley's husband, Jamal. Jamal was a 34-year-old African-American man who desperately wanted the world to believe he was the next great Silicon Valley billionaire. He stepped out of the SUV draped head to toe in obnoxiously loud designer clothing. He wore a brightly patterned silk shirt unbuttoned halfway down his chest, a glaringly fake gold watch, and designer sunglasses that covered half his face. A heavy gold chain rested against his collarbone, and a blinking Bluetooth earpiece was permanently wedged in his right ear, a prop he used to fake important business calls. He carried himself with an insufferable arrogant swagger, projecting an aura of immense, untouchable wealth. I knew the truth. I knew his last two tech startups had completely imploded. I knew he was drowning in a sea of defaulted loans and angry creditors. Jamal was nothing but a charismatic fraud, a tech bro who used empty corporate buzzwords to mask his utter incompetence. Yet my parents treated him like a financial messiah, blindly funding his delusions while scoffing at my legitimate grueling career on Wall Street. I unlocked the front door and stepped out onto the porch. Gary and Brenda barely acknowledged me. My mother simply breezed past me, muttering that the coastal humidity was ruining her hair and demanding to know where the thermostat was located. My father gave me a brisk, dismissive nod, telling me to prop the front doors open because they had a lot of heavy furniture to bring inside. I remained silent, my eyes fixed on Jamal. He did not greet me. He did not say hello or thank me for opening my home. He completely bypassed my existence. Jamal clapped his hands loudly, the sharp sound echoing across the driveway, and began barking aggressive orders at the hired movers, like he was a plantation owner addressing the help. "I want all the heavy office equipment unloaded first," Jamal shouted, pointing a manicured finger toward the back of the moving truck while speaking into his Bluetooth earpiece to a phantom business partner. "My venture capital investors are expecting a crucial video pitch by noon, and I cannot have them looking at a background of cheap cardboard boxes. Grab those massive wardrobe boxes next. Be careful with those, they are full of custom Italian suits." The lead mover wiped sweat from his brow and asked where the boxes needed to go. Jamal did not even pause to consult me. He pointed directly up to the top floor of my house, his finger aiming straight at the massive bay windows of my master suite. Take all of our personal items and my office set up straight up to the master bedroom on the third floor. Jamal commanded, his voice dripping with unearned authority. The one with the ocean view and the private balcony. My wife needs the attached soaking tub, and I need the best natural lighting for my investor calls. Do not scratch the walls on your way up. My breath caught in my throat. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of his command was staggering. He was a broke, failed entrepreneur, moving into his sister-in-law's house after her parents lost everything, and his first action was to lay claim to the largest, most luxurious room in the property. He was essentially evicting me from my own bedroom within 5 minutes of arriving. Ashley walked up the porch steps carrying a tiny designer dog in her purse. She offered me a sickly, sweet, condescending smile. "Do not worry, Cassidy," she said smoothly. "Jamal and I will need the master suite since he is running a high-level company and needs the space to generate revenue. You can just take the basement room. It is much quieter down there anyway, which is better for someone who is currently unemployed." My hands balled into tight fists at my sides, my fingernails biting hard into my palms. Every protective instinct screamed at me to block the doorway, to physically throw them off the porch, and to call the local police right then and there. I wanted to scream that Jamal was a broke, pathetic fraud and that this entire estate belonged solely to me. But I remembered the hidden cameras recording every single second of this interaction from the ceiling above us. I remembered the partitioned internet network waiting silently for Jamal to log in and expose his financial crimes. If I threw them out now, it would be a brief, unsatisfying argument. If I let them inside, I could completely dismantle their entire lives. I forced my muscles to relax. I unclenched my fists and offered Ashley a smooth, emotionless smile. I stepped aside, leaving the doorway wide open. I told the movers to go right ahead and take everything up to the master suite. Jamal strutted past me, adjusting his sunglasses, completely unaware that he had just crossed the threshold into his own digital execution chamber. The heavy thud of work boots immediately began echoing up the grand staircase. Movers lugged massive cardboard boxes and oversized leather furniture right past my carefully arranged coastal decor. My parents had already made themselves comfortable in the living room. Gary was complaining about the placement of the television while Brenda aggressively adjusted the angle of my sofa to better suit her preferences. They acted as if I were merely the temporary caretaker of a property they had finally come to claim. I took a slow breath, absorbing the chaotic energy they brought into my home, and walked up the stairs to check the damage on the third floor. When I reached the landing of the master suite, I found a scene of blatant disrespect. The heavy oak doors were wide open. Ashley had not even waited for the movers to bring all their bags up before she started asserting her dominance. She was standing in the center of my bedroom, physically yanking my silk hangers out of the walk-in closet. She threw my tailored blazers, my casual dresses, and even my delicate personal items into a haphazard pile in the hallway. A pair of my favorite heels clattered against the baseboard as she carelessly tossed them aside. I stepped into the doorway and asked her exactly what she thought she was doing. Ashley did not even have the grace to look embarrassed. She turned around, placing one hand on her hip, and looked at me with an expression of unadulterated contempt. She sneered, telling me that the closet space was too small to hold both her extensive designer wardrobe and Jamal's custom suits. She pointed toward the large bay windows overlooking the crashing waves and announced that Jamal was in the critical stages of raising capital for a revolutionary artificial intelligence startup. According to her, he absolutely needed the Ocean View Master Suite to serve as a luxurious office to host wealthy investors on video calls. She looked me up and down, her eyes full of harsh judgment. She told me that since I was unemployed and doing absolutely nothing with my life, I did not need the best room in the house. She waved her hand dismissively toward the staircase and told me to just take the basement. It was a direct command, not a polite request. She completely expected me to grovel, to cry, or to start a massive screaming match that would inevitably draw our parents upstairs to take her side. The sheer rage burning inside my chest was intense enough to set the entire room on fire. Every single fiber of my being wanted to grab her by the shoulders and physically throw her out of my house. But my analytical mind quickly calculated the immediate variables. A screaming match right now would merely result in a messy, chaotic standoff. It would give them a perfect chance to play the ultimate victims. If I wanted to execute a flawless, legally devastating counterstrike, I needed them completely comfortable. I needed them to firmly believe they had permanently won. I forced my facial muscles to relax into an expression of quiet defeat. I lowered my eyes, gathered my discarded clothes from the hallway floor, and told her I would clear out the rest of my things. Ashley smirked, clearly thrilled by my immediate and total submission. She turned her back to me and quickly began loudly planning exactly where she would place her massive new vanity table. I spent the next hour quietly moving my remaining belongings. I carried my clothes, my personal files, and most importantly, my high-end computer equipment down the 2 flights of stairs to the basement. The lower level of the house was actually quite spacious and nicely finished, featuring a small kitchenette and a very comfortable bedroom, but it was completely cut off from the ocean views and the natural light of the upper floors. To them, it was a dark dungeon meant for the family failure. To me, it was the perfect fortified bunker to operate unseen. Once I had moved the very last of my essential tech gear downstairs, I firmly locked the heavy basement door and sat down at my desk. The air down here was cool and completely silent. I powered up my primary workstation and brought my command center online. 3 large glowing monitors illuminated the dim room. On the left screen, the hidden security cameras fed me crystal clear video of my family arrogantly parading around my living spaces. On the center screen, the network administration panel displayed the active router activity. I cracked my knuckles and typed in the final command lines to fully activate the deep packet inspection software. The digital snare was now completely armed and perfectly invisible. I did not have to wait very long. Less than 20 minutes after I settled firmly into the basement, a small notification pinged loudly on my center monitor. The trap had just been triggered. Up in the master suite, Jamal had grown tired of barking meaningless orders at the movers and decided it was time to establish his fake digital presence. He opened his expensive laptop and his smartphone, eagerly searching for a strong wireless connection. He found the vulnerable decoy network I had specifically named and left entirely unprotected. Without a single thought for standard cybersecurity, he instantly connected both of his personal devices. I watched the activity log light up with rapidly incoming data. Lines of code cascaded quickly down my screen as my tracker instantly breached his unsecured connection. Jamal was typing away in my bedroom, completely oblivious that every website he visited, every password he entered, and every encrypted message he sent was being mirrored directly to my server. He thought he had successfully commandeered a luxury office to run his massive fake empire. In reality, he had just plugged his entire life directly into the mainframe of a seasoned financial investigator. The hostile takeover was now completely mine. The morning began with heavy, loud footsteps descending the stairs. I had barely slept, fueled by caffeine and the adrenaline of watching Jamal's digital footprint expand across my monitors. I quickly minimized the tracking software just as the heavy basement door swung open without a single knock. My father marched into the room, his jaw set in that familiar domineering line. He did not ask if I had slept well. He simply marched to my desk and tossed a crumpled piece of notebook paper right over my keyboard. I looked down at the hastily scribbled list titled Household Budget. Gary crossed his arms and stared down at me. He announced that since I was no longer working a real job and spending my days hiding in the basement, it was only fair I pull my weight around the property. He demanded I cover the cost of all groceries for the 5 of us, including Ashley's highly specific organic diet and Jamal's expensive protein shakes. He casually added that I would be responsible for the entire utility bill, which would absolutely skyrocket with 5 adults living here, plus a weekly cleaning fee. Unless I wanted to scrub toilets myself, I needed to hire a professional crew to keep the estate up to his standards. His justification was incredibly predictable. He claimed family members needed to support each other during transitional phases, conveniently ignoring that this was my house and they forced their way inside. The sheer financial extortion was staggering. He was taxing me to live in my own basement while they enjoyed a luxury vacation upstairs. The teenager who emptied her bank account out of pure terror would have cried and begged him to reconsider. I would have tried to explain how much I sacrificed to buy this home. But the woman sitting here now knew arguing with a narcissist was a massive waste of tactical leverage. I looked up at my father, forcing my shoulders to slump in a posture of complete defeat. I softened my voice, stripping away any hint of the fierce corporate analyst, and told him I understood. I promised I would set up a joint grocery account and handle the utility payments immediately. I even offered to look into local cleaning services so Brenda would not have to worry about dust. Gary smiled, a look of profound satisfaction settling over his features. He patted the top of my desk condescendingly, praised me for finally acting like a team player, and marched back up the stairs. The moment the door clicked shut, my defeated posture vanished. I sat up straight, pulled up a fresh document, and meticulously logged the interaction. Extortion. Financial coercion. I noted the date, the time, and the exact dollar amounts he was demanding. Every unreasonable demand he made was just another nail in their collective coffin. With Gary successfully managed, I turned my attention back to the security camera feeds. Up on the main floor, the absolute absurdity of their invasion was reaching new heights. Jamal had dressed himself in a glaringly bright tailored suit, complete with a silk pocket square and loafers that had clearly never touched actual pavement. He was strutting back and forth across my expansive mahogany deck, holding his smartphone out on a stabilizing gimbal. He was recording content for his social media followers and potential investors, broadcasting his fake reality to the world. I turned up the audio feed on my left monitor. Jamal was speaking with loud, aggressive confidence. He swept his camera across the breathtaking view of the Atlantic Ocean and the private beach access. He proudly declared to his audience that hard work and visionary thinking always paid off. He boldly claimed that this $1.2 million coastal estate was the newest addition to his rapidly expanding real estate portfolio. He spun the camera around to show the high ceilings and luxury finishes of my living room, attributing this magnificent purchase directly to the massive success of his upcoming artificial intelligence platform. He used an endless stream of hollow corporate buzzwords, talking about disruptive algorithms, synergistic paradigms, and exponential growth metrics. It was a flawless performance of wealth and success, perfectly tailored to deceive desperate investors who wanted a piece of his non-existent empire. I sat in the cool, dark basement and watched this man parade around my home, taking absolute credit for the 10 years of blood, sweat, and panic attacks I had endured on Wall Street. A deep, simmering fury burned in my chest, hot and sharp, but I did not let it consume me. I channeled that anger directly into focus. I looked away from the video feed of his arrogant strutting and shifted my eyes to the center monitor, displaying his active network traffic. The contrast between his public bravado and his digital reality was pathetic. While he was loudly boasting about purchasing luxury real estate on the deck, my deep packet inspection software was silently pulling his actual financial statements from his unsecured laptop upstairs. I watched the numbers roll across my screen. His primary checking account was overdrawn by $400. He had 3 credit cards completely maxed out, accumulating late fees at an alarming rate. I intercepted a frantic email he had just received from a disgruntled investor demanding the return of a $50,000 seed round investment, threatening legal action if Jamal did not respond by the end of the week. He was entirely broke, hopelessly in debt, and drowning in a sea of his own fraudulent lies. His flashy clothes and loud confidence were nothing but a desperate smokescreen. He was not a tech visionary. He was a cornered animal playing dress-up in my house. I leaned back in my chair, steepled my fingers, and allowed myself a genuine smile. Let him film his videos. Let him claim my sanctuary as his own. Every single lie he broadcasted to the internet would soon serve as undeniable evidence of wire fraud. I watched the green progress bar on my decryption software slowly fill the center monitor, giving me plenty of time to reflect on exactly how Jamal had managed to infiltrate our family. The blind adoration my parents showered upon him was not a new phenomenon. It started 4 years ago when Ashley first brought him home to a Thanksgiving dinner. Back then, Jamal was pitching a revolutionary fitness application. He used the exact same loud confidence and hollow corporate jargon that he was currently broadcasting from my deck. My father, a man who measured human worth purely by perceived financial status, was instantly mesmerized. Gary saw Jamal as the ambitious, wealthy son he had always desperately wanted, completely ignoring the glaring fact that Jamal had zero actual product to show. Over the next 2 years, I watched from the sidelines in absolute horror as my parents willingly handed over a staggering portion of their retirement savings to fund Jamal's wild delusions. The fitness app collapsed within 8 months. Jamal blamed the changing market conditions and smoothly pivoted to a logistics software startup. Gary blindly wrote another massive check. When that second company imploded, leaving behind a trail of unpaid contractors and empty promises, Jamal somehow convinced my family that the failure was due to a lack of visionary investors, not his own incompetence. Despite draining hundreds of thousands of dollars from Gary's bank accounts, my family continued to treat Jamal like an undiscovered genius on the verge of changing the world. Anyone who questioned his methods, namely me, was quickly labeled jealous and unsupportive. They practically worshipped the ground he walked on, completely blinded by his flashy suits and rented luxury cars. Now sitting in the cold basement of my own home, I finally had the unfiltered truth flowing directly onto my screens. The decryption key finished running with a soft chime, granting me full access to the encrypted folders Jamal was foolishly transferring over my compromised network. I opened the first batch of documents and began to meticulously peel back the layers of his current operation. He called it an artificial intelligence platform designed to disrupt global supply chains. As I cross-referenced his financial logs with the emails I had just intercepted, the actual picture emerged, and it was significantly darker than mere incompetence. Jamal was not just failing at business, he was actively committing severe financial crimes. I pulled up a complex spreadsheet hidden deep within a nested folder on his desktop. It detailed a dizzying maze of offshore shell companies registered in countries with notoriously lax financial regulations. Jamal was moving capital through a tangled web of shady cryptocurrency wallets to obscure the origins of the funds. The money was not going towards software development or hiring engineers. It was being rapidly funneled into personal accounts to fund his lavish lifestyle. He was using fresh investments to pay off the dividends of earlier investors, creating a classic, unsustainable illusion of profitability. I isolated his primary email inbox and began reading through the urgent messages he had flagged. The desperation in these communications was palpable. There were dozens of emails from angry individuals demanding to know why their promised returns were delayed. One message from an elderly investor begged for the return of $100,000, explaining that the money was needed for urgent medical care. Jamal had callously ignored the email, moving the sender to a blocked list. Another thread showed a sophisticated investor threatening to contact federal authorities if a thorough audit of the company assets was not provided within 72 hours. Jamal was spinning plates, telling increasingly elaborate lies to keep the entire structure from crashing down around him. I sat back and rubbed my eyes, the blue light of the monitors reflecting off the concrete walls. He was not building an artificial intelligence company. He was running a massive, highly illegal Ponzi scheme right out of my master bedroom. The arrogance required to orchestrate this level of fraud while actively squatting in a family member's home was almost difficult to comprehend. He felt completely untouchable, shielded by my parents' unwavering support and his own grandiose delusions. He assumed that because he could easily manipulate Gary and Brenda, he could just as easily manipulate the federal financial system. But he made one fatal miscalculation. He brought his entire criminal enterprise directly into the heavily fortified domain of a Wall Street risk analyst who specialized in dismantling corporate fraud. Every document I downloaded, every cryptocurrency transaction I traced, and every threatening email I archived was meticulously organized into a secure digital dossier. I was building a comprehensive prosecution file that a federal prosecutor would salivate over. I did not just have a smoking gun, I had the entire armory. I locked the folders behind military-grade encryption and leaned forward, my focus razor-sharp. Jamal thought he was a predator claiming new territory. He had absolutely no idea he had just handed me the rope to hang him. The sheer volume of evidence was overwhelming. I categorized the shell companies, tracing the initial seed money directly back to the vulnerable investors he had targeted. His digital footprint was a messy trail of breadcrumbs leading straight to federal prison. The deeper I dug into his files, the more clearly I saw the inevitable collapse of his scheme. He was siphoning funds at a rate that guaranteed bankruptcy within weeks. The undeniable fact that my parents were proudly sleeping upstairs under the exact same roof as this brazen criminal mastermind filled me with a cold, absolute sense of vindication. They had actively chosen to align themselves with a flashy fraudster, while entirely dismissing the daughter who had built real wealth through grueling honesty and sheer determination. As I finalized the highly advanced backup protocols on my secure local server, I knew beyond any doubt that my digital trap was fully armed and operational. Jamal was digging his own grave and I was holding the shovel. 2 weeks passed since the initial invasion, marked by a grueling routine of silent observation and strategic compliance. I maintained the facade of the defeated, obedient daughter perfectly. I paid the exorbitant utility bills, stocked the commercial refrigerator with Ashley's preferred organic produce, and remained quietly confined to my basement sanctuary while they loudly claimed dominion over the upper floors. Every day, the heavy thud of Jamal pacing the mahogany deck above me served as a constant reminder of his escalating delusions. His fake venture capital calls echoed down the ventilation shafts, filled with desperate promises and fabricated revenue projections. My digital dragnet captured every frantic scramble for cash, but his financial hemorrhaging was outpacing his ability to secure new victims. He needed a massive influx of capital immediately, or his entire house of cards would collapse before the month ended. I knew a desperate fraudster would inevitably make a reckless move. I just had to wait for him to cross the line from digital deception into physical trespass. The escalation happened on a humid Tuesday afternoon. I had just returned from a mandatory grocery run, my trunk loaded with premium steaks and imported wine that Gary had aggressively added to the weekly household budget. As I pulled my modest sedan onto the crushed gravel of my driveway, I immediately hit the brakes. Two sleek midnight black luxury vehicles were parked directly in front of my porch. They were not rentals, and they certainly did not belong to my bankrupt parents. I killed the engine and sat perfectly still, analyzing the new variables. The license plates were out of state, registered to wealthy coastal zip codes. My analytical instincts flared. Jamal was not expecting legitimate tech investors to visit the property in person. His entire operation relied on the safety of remote video calls, where he could control the narrative and hide the absolute lack of an actual product. Inviting external parties onto the premises meant he was executing a completely different tactical maneuver. I slipped out of my car, deliberately leaving the heavy grocery bags in the trunk. I bypassed the main entrance and used my discreet side access door, slipping into the house with absolute silence. I moved through the narrow utility corridor that connected the basement to the main floor pantry, keeping my footsteps light against the polished hardwood. From the shadows of the hallway, I had a clear, unobstructed view of the expansive living room and the massive oceanfront deck. Jamal was standing in the center of my living room, dressed in a crisp linen suit, holding a glass of my expensive vintage wine. He was holding court for two well-dressed couples who looked like they had just stepped out of a luxury travel magazine. Ashley stood beside him, nodding approvingly, and playing the role of the gracious, wealthy hostess. Gary and Brenda were nowhere to be seen, likely dispatched to run errands or sent to the country club so Jamal could stage his elaborate performance without interference. I pressed myself against the cool plaster of the hallway wall and listened. Jamal swept his arm toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, highlighting the private beach access and the custom infinity pool. He boldly announced to the strangers that he had purchased this estate as a private corporate retreat. However, since he and his wife were relocating to Europe to launch their international headquarters, they had decided to lease the property to a select exclusive clientele. He was offering them a long-term summer lease, demanding a staggering $30,000 upfront security deposit to secure the specific dates. The sheer audacity of his scheme locked the breath in my throat. He was not just running a digital Ponzi scheme. He was actively running a fraudulent real estate scam, using my home as the bait. He was targeting wealthy vacationers, demanding massive non-refundable wire transfers to secure luxury bookings for a property he did not legally own. He intended to farm these enormous deposits to satisfy his angry investors and keep his fake artificial intelligence company afloat for a few more weeks. By the time summer arrived, and these people showed up with their families expecting a beachfront paradise, Jamal would be long gone, leaving me to deal with the furious victims and the resulting legal fallout. I did not storm into the room. I did not scream that this was my house or demand that the strangers leave immediately. Interrupting the tour would only create a chaotic situation, allowing Jamal to spin another lie and escape accountability. Instead, I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and activated the high-resolution camera. I remained completely concealed in the shadows of the utility corridor, capturing clear, undeniable photographs of the prospective victims. I zoomed in on their faces, their expensive watches, and the sleek leather portfolios they carried. I recorded high-quality audio of Jamal confidently quoting fraudulent leasing terms and directing them to wire the funds to his offshore holding account. I documented every single detail of the transaction, gathering pristine evidence of a massive premeditated real estate scam. Once the tour concluded, Jamal escorted the couples out to the driveway. I moved swiftly to the front window, remaining out of sight behind the heavy linen curtains. I captured crisp images of their license plates and the branding on the side of their vehicles. I watched Jamal shake their hands, flashing his charismatic, predatory smile as they drove away. I retreated to my basement command center, securely locking the heavy steel door behind me. I dropped into my ergonomic chair and immediately brought my advanced tracking software online. I ran a targeted search through exclusive luxury vacation rental platforms. Within 10 minutes, I found his fraudulent listing. Jamal was actively soliciting massive felony wire transfers, using my property as his personal bait. He uploaded falsified ownership deeds to bypass platform security. Every dollar he collected was another nail in his coffin. The trap was set. I waited exactly 2 hours for the driveway to clear completely. Gary and Brenda had taken Ashley to a coastal boutique, leaving Jamal alone in the house to manage his supposed empire. This was the perfect tactical opening. I walked up from the basement, my footsteps deliberately heavy on the hardwood stairs to announce my presence. I found Jamal in the kitchen, leaning casually against the marble island. He was pouring a glass of my expensive sparkling water, his Bluetooth earpiece blinking aggressively against his ear. He looked up, his expression immediately shifting into a mask of supreme annoyance, as if my presence in my own kitchen was an offensive intrusion. I did not raise my voice or display any outward signs of anger. I walked directly to the refrigerator, grabbed a bottle of cold water, and turned to face him squarely. I told him I saw the black luxury vehicles in the driveway. I told him I heard his pitch to the couples about leasing the property for the summer season. Jamal let out a sharp, condescending laugh. He set his glass down and crossed his arms, stepping directly into my personal space in a blatant attempt at physical intimidation. He did not deny anything. In his mind, he was completely untouchable. He looked down at me with absolute, unfiltered disdain. "I am generating real cash flow, Cassidy," he sneered, his voice dripping with supreme arrogance. "You wouldn't understand business. You spent your life working a sad corporate job punching a clock for someone else. I am a visionary. I am securing massive capital to scale my platform." I stood my ground, my face devoid of emotion. I reminded him that this was my house purchased with my own money, and he had no legal right to lease it to anyone. Jamal chuckled, shaking his head slowly as if dealing with a stubborn child. He took another step forward, violating my personal space completely. He leaned in closer, dropping his voice into a menacing theatrical whisper designed to instill terror. "Keep your mouth shut or Gary will throw you out of your own house. Your father knows who the real provider is in this family. He knows I am the only one bringing in actual wealth. If you say one word about my investors, he will pack your basement junk into trash bags and leave them on the curb. You will be homeless by nightfall. Do you understand me?" His threat hung heavily in the humid air. A normal person would have called the police to report a trespasser attempting fraud, but reacting emotionally would only blow my carefully constructed cover. I looked at his smug face, absorbing the certainty shining in his eyes. He believed my father's approval gave him supreme legal authority over my assets. He truly thought his cheap intimidation tactics would force me into terrified submission. I did not argue. I did not defend my grueling career or my rightful ownership of the property. I simply offered him a faint, compliant nod, casting my eyes downward in a perfect imitation of a defeated victim. Jamal smirked, entirely victorious, and turned his back to me to resume his fake business calls. I quietly walked out of the kitchen, retreating down the hallway toward the basement door. Every step I took away from him was a calculated withdrawal. I locked the heavy steel door behind me and descended into the cool darkness of my command center. I dropped into my ergonomic chair and brought my workstation out of sleep mode. Jamal had dared me to understand business. I was about to show him exactly what my kind of business looked like. I bypassed the standard web browsers and launched a specialized financial tracking toolkit I had developed during my years analyzing corporate fraud on Wall Street. I needed to move past the superficial layers of his fake rental listings and access the raw transactional data underneath. Using the network intercept logs I had already established, I isolated the exact routing protocols Jamal had used to communicate with the rental platform. He had uploaded forged deeds to bypass their host verification process. I ran a targeted script to extract the back-end receipt ledgers tied directly to his user account. The data flooded onto my central monitor, painting a pristine, horrifying picture of his financial crimes. Jamal was not just taking simple security deposits. He was demanding full summer season payments wired directly into an offshore account, circumventing the rental platform's built-in escrow protections entirely. I matched the wire transfer receipts to the prospective tenants I had photographed earlier. $30,000 here, $50,000 there. The total sum of his active fraud was staggering, completely eclipsing the perceived value of his failed startup. He was stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars across state lines. I methodically compiled every single specific data point into a heavily encrypted, meticulously organized digital binder, ensuring that no technical loophole could be exploited by defense attorneys in a future trial. I captured the falsified property listings, the forged ownership documents bearing his signature, the IP logs placing the origin of the fraud directly on his laptop, and the clear routing numbers for his offshore accounts. I linked the faces of the victims from my security cameras directly to their corresponding wire transfers. The evidence was absolutely pristine, irrefutable, and ready for immediate deployment. This was no longer a simple family dispute over boundaries. By utilizing telecommunications networks to solicit fraudulent funds across state lines, Jamal had elevated his petty scam to the level of a severe federal offense. He had firmly tied himself to felony real estate fraud and massive wire fraud. I backed up the entire completed dossier to an incredibly secure off-site server located in a separate jurisdiction. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the compiled evidence. Jamal thought my father could protect him from the consequences of his actions. He was about to painfully learn that Gary's booming voice meant absolutely nothing against the crushing weight of a federal indictment. That evening, the heavy front door slammed shut, signaling the departure of my unwelcome guests. Gary, Brenda, Ashley, and Jamal had decided to treat themselves to a lavish dinner at the local coastal country club. They were celebrating Jamal's supposed leasing success, ordering premium steaks and top-shelf liquor, all funded by the credit card Gary coerced me into providing for groceries. Their audacity in draining my funds to toast fraudulent victories would have infuriated a normal person. I viewed it as the necessary cost of doing business. Buying their absence was a cheap price to pay for the operational freedom I desperately needed. I listened to the engine of their luxury SUV fade down the long driveway. The moment the property was entirely silent, I emerged from the basement. My target was not Jamal this time. I needed to understand the exact mechanisms driving my parents' sudden chaotic relocation. Their story about downsizing for retirement never made logical sense. My father was a man obsessed with appearances, and voluntarily relinquishing a massive suburban estate to move in with his disgraced daughter went against every narcissistic trait he possessed. There was a missing variable in this equation, and I was going to find it. I walked quietly up to the second floor and entered the guest bedroom Gary had commandeered as his personal study. He had dragged a heavy oak table to the center of the room to serve as his executive desk. Papers were scattered across the surface, mixed with golf magazines and empty whiskey glasses. My eyes locked onto his silver iPad, resting unguarded next to a legal notepad. Gary was a creature of arrogant habit. He believed he was the absolute master of this domain, rendering basic security measures entirely unnecessary in his mind. I tapped the screen. It was not even locked with a passcode. He had left it open, assuming no one would dare to invade his private workspace. I slid into his chair and began executing a rapid audit of his digital life. I opened his primary email application and bypassed the read messages, diving straight into the archived and hidden folders. People hiding financial ruin always try to compartmentalize their disaster. Within 3 minutes, my seasoned eyes caught the exact pattern of institutional distress I had spent a decade analyzing on Wall Street. I opened a chain of emails from a major national bank, expecting to see routine mortgage statements. Instead, I found a digital graveyard. The subject lines progressed from polite payment reminders to aggressive notices of default, culminating in a harsh notice of foreclosure. I read through the attached PDF documents, my analytical mind processing the cold, hard numbers. Gary and Brenda did not sell their sprawling home to embark on a relaxing retirement. They had been forcibly evicted by the bank. The timeline of the notices lined up perfectly with their abrupt arrival at my beach house. The bank had seized their property just 48 hours before Brenda made that midnight phone call demanding my sanctuary. They had packed their moving truck under the humiliating cover of darkness, fleeing their upscale neighborhood before their wealthy friends could witness their absolute financial destruction. They came to my home because they literally had nowhere else to go. But a simple foreclosure did not fully explain the magnitude of this collapse. My parents had owned that house for 20 years. They had significant equity. Something massive had drained their accounts dry. I minimized the foreclosure notices and opened Gary's banking application, navigating to his transaction history. The missing variable materialized right before my eyes. 14 months ago, Gary had taken out a massive home equity line of credit, draining $500,000 directly from the value of their property. I traced the outbound wire transfers. The funds did not go toward home renovations or legitimate retirement investments. Every single dollar was funneled into highly volatile, unregulated cryptocurrency wallets. I recognized the routing addresses immediately. They were the exact offshore shell accounts I had already linked to Jamal's fraudulent artificial intelligence company. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening clarity. Jamal had not just bankrupted two small startups. He had actively convinced my father to bet his entire life savings, his home, and his financial security on a massive crypto illusion. Gary, blinded by his desperate desire to have a billionaire tech mogul for a son-in-law, had handed $500,000 to a charismatic con artist. Jamal took the money, blew it on designer suits and luxury car leases to maintain his fake image, and left my parents completely destitute. I sat perfectly still in the quiet room, the glow of the iPad illuminating my face. The reality of their situation was far worse than simple entitlement. They were entirely bankrupt. They had zero savings, zero assets, and zero income. Their aggressive takeover of my beach house was not just a display of arrogance, it was an act of desperate primal survival. They had lost everything to the golden child's husband, and instead of holding Jamal accountable, they had agreed to parasitize my life to maintain their illusion of wealth. Gary was using intimidation to force me to pay their bills because his own accounts were overdrawn. Brenda strutted around my living room boasting about Jamal's success because admitting the truth would destroy her ego. They were all drowning in a spectacular financial collapse, clinging to my hard-earned assets to keep themselves afloat. They truly believed they could steal my home, transfer the deed, and use my wealth to replace what Jamal had incinerated. I locked the iPad, returning it to its exact position on the desk. I stood up and walked to the window, watching the dark waves crash against the shoreline. My parents were not just unwelcome guests. They were predators entirely reliant on my destruction. They thought they had secured the perfect host. They were about to discover that the host was toxic. The sound of the luxury SUV crunching against the gravel driveway signaled the return of my predators. They walked through the front door laughing loudly, completely intoxicated by expensive wine and their own shared delusions. Ashley's shrill voice echoed through the high ceilings as she complained about the country club's service, while Jamal boasted about a fake investor call he planned for the morning. I remained in the shadows of the hallway for a moment, watching them move comfortably through my home. Brenda immediately began rearranging the throw pillows on my sofa while Gary poured himself a glass of my scotch. They looked like the perfect, wealthy, cohesive family unit. Armed with the devastating knowledge I had just extracted from Gary's unlocked tablet, their arrogant performance was almost comical. They were entirely bankrupt, yet they strutted around my living room like royalty. Gary noticed me standing near the kitchen entrance. His relaxed demeanor vanished instantly, replaced by the hardened, authoritative scowl he always used to force compliance. He set his scotch glass down heavily on the marble coffee table and gestured toward the oversized armchair opposite the sofa. He announced that we needed to have a serious family meeting immediately. His tone left absolutely no room for negotiation. It was the exact same voice he had used 15 years ago when he ordered me to empty my college savings account. He wanted to assert dominance and remind me of my designated place at the bottom of the family hierarchy. I walked into the living room and took a seat, crossing my legs and folding my hands in my lap. Brenda sat next to Gary, her face arranged in a mask of maternal concern that did not quite reach her cold eyes. Ashley and Jamal stood behind the sofa, presenting a united, intimidating front. Jamal crossed his arms, smirking down at me as if he had already won whatever game they were playing. Gary reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, dropping them onto the coffee table with a loud, dramatic thud. My eyes immediately caught the bold heading on the top page. It was a comprehensive general power of attorney form. My stomach tightened slightly as I recognized my own youthful signature on the final page. I had signed that document during my freshman year of college, right after they drained my bank account. Gary had convinced me it was a mandatory safety measure for student loans and emergency medical decisions while I was away at school. I had been young, terrified, and completely ignorant of the sweeping legal authority I was handing over to a financially reckless narcissist. I had forgotten that document even existed, but Gary had kept it safely filed away for over a decade, waiting for the perfect moment to weaponize my blind trust. Gary tapped his finger against the stack of papers and looked me straight in the eye. He declared that my recent erratic behavior and sudden career instability had deeply concerned the entire family. He claimed that walking away from a lucrative Wall Street career without a solid backup plan proved I was incapable of managing my own significant assets. According to his twisted logic, my mental health was rapidly deteriorating, and the family needed to step in to protect my financial future before I destroyed myself completely. Brenda chimed in smoothly, playing her role perfectly. She leaned forward and told me that they loved me too much to watch me fail. She said the family needed a strong, unified financial strategy to weather the current economic climate. Then Gary pulled a second document from the bottom of the stack and slid it across the glass table toward me. It was a formal quitclaim deed for my Hilton Head beach house. Gary instructed me to sign the deed immediately. He explained that the document would formally add Ashley and Jamal to the property title as co-owners. He framed this massive theft as a brilliant strategic maneuver to keep the family wealth completely secure. Since Jamal was apparently a visionary entrepreneur on the verge of massive success, Gary argued that legally tying Jamal to this luxury real estate would instantly boost his corporate valuation and secure crucial venture capital funding. In return, Jamal would supposedly use his upcoming billionaire status to take care of me for the rest of my life. They were essentially ordering me to hand over half of my $1.2 million sanctuary to a man who had already bankrupted them. I stared at the quitclaim deed, the sheer audacity of their ambush washing over me. They were using a predatory combination of fake concern and ancient legal leverage to hijack my only safe haven. When I did not immediately pick up the pen, Gary escalated his tactics. His voice dropped into a low, threatening growl. He leaned across the coffee table, invading my personal space, and delivered his ultimate ultimatum. He told me that if I refused to sign the deed tonight, I would be completely cut off from the family forever. He threatened to use the old power of attorney to aggressively freeze my bank accounts and entangle me in a brutal legal battle that would drain whatever savings I had left. He declared that a daughter who refused to support her family's collective future was no daughter of his. Brenda nodded in agreement, wiping a fake tear from her eye, while Ashley smiled triumphantly from the background. They were threatening me with total abandonment and financial ruin, completely unaware that I already knew they had zero money and zero power to fight me. I looked down at the quitclaim deed, formulating my exact response. The heavy silence stretched across the expansive living room as they waited for my terrified compliance. They truly expected me to break down, to cry, and to surrender everything I owned just to keep their toxic love. They drastically underestimated the woman sitting before them. I slowly reached across the polished glass table. My movements were deliberate and unhurried. I picked up the pristine quitclaim deed, feeling the heavy weight of the expensive cardstock between my fingers. Gary leaned back, a triumphant gleam in his eyes, fully expecting me to reach for the silver pen resting beside the document. Brenda let out a small, satisfied sigh, assuming the battle was already won. Instead of signing away my sanctuary, I gripped the top edge of the legal document and ripped it straight down the middle. The sharp, tearing sound echoed like a gunshot through the silent living room. I stacked the two halves together and tore them again, reducing their meticulously crafted ambush into worthless scraps of paper. I let the pieces flutter from my hands, watching them drift down onto the glass table like a pathetic snowfall. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. Brenda let out a high-pitched gasp, covering her mouth with both hands, as if she had just witnessed a violent crime. Ashley jolted forward, her eyes wide with genuine shock, while Jamal physically took a step back, his arrogant smirk instantly evaporating. But it was Gary who completely lost control. His face turned a deep, dangerous shade of purple. The veins in his neck bulged against his collar as he sprang up from the sofa. He slammed his fist down onto the coffee table, rattling the crystal glasses and scattering the torn pieces of the deed. He screamed that I was an ungrateful, disrespectful child, making the biggest mistake of my life. His voice boomed through the high ceilings, a desperate attempt to use volume and aggression to force me back into submission. I did not flinch. I did not lean back. I sat perfectly still, maintaining unbroken eye contact, watching the patriarch of my family completely unravel. When his screaming failed to elicit a single tear or apology from me, Gary resorted to his ultimate contingency plan. He straightened his posture, breathing heavily, and pulled his trump card. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. He declared that my defiance did not matter anymore because they had already outsmarted me. His voice dropped into a sneering, malicious tone as he laid out his legal trap. He announced proudly that they had been living in this house for over 14 days. He revealed that they had officially forwarded all their mail from their old address directly to my Hilton Head property. He smiled a predatory, vicious smile and stated that under South Carolina state law, they had officially established squatter rights. The sheer malice in his voice was staggering. My own father was proudly admitting that he had weaponized the legal system to steal my home. Gary crossed his arms, basking in his perceived victory. He explained the law to me as if I were a slow child. He told me that because they were now considered legal residents, I could not simply call the police and have them removed. He boasted that I could not change the locks, cut off the utilities, or physically throw them out without facing criminal charges myself. He said I would have to initiate a formal, grueling eviction process through the court system, a bureaucratic nightmare that would take many months, if not an entire year, to resolve. Ashley stepped out from behind the sofa, her confidence returning as she joined the attack. She laughed, telling me that I was stuck with them whether I liked it or not. She proudly added that Jamal would use the master suite as his corporate headquarters for the next year without paying a single dime in rent. Jamal puffed out his chest again, adjusting his designer watch, clearly thrilled by the prospect of living rent-free while maintaining his billionaire facade. Brenda nodded along, her fake maternal concern, entirely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating greed. She told me I should have just signed the paperwork because now I had brought this legal nightmare upon myself. Gary was not finished. He leaned over the table again, delivering his final crushing blow. He promised that while the slow eviction process dragged on through the courts, he would make my life an absolute living hell. He threatened to countersue me for emotional distress and unlawful eviction practices. He vowed to drag my name through the mud, leverage my old power of attorney to freeze my accounts, and legally tie up the property so completely that I would be financially ruined. By the time the dust settles, Gary spat, "I will sue you for half of this property equity, just to cover my legal fees and damages. You will lose this house, Cassidy. You will lose everything you built, and you will end up right back where you started, begging us for help." They stood together, a unified front of parasites, entirely convinced they had locked me in an inescapable legal cage. They thought they had brilliantly exploited a legal loophole that left me powerless. They expected me to panic and finally surrender out of sheer exhaustion and fear. The threat of losing half my equity was supposed to be the final kill shot. I listened closely, committing his strategy to memory. My analytical mind processed his pathetic grasp at legal straws. He was relying on generic residential tenancy laws designed to protect vulnerable renters from homelessness. He had spent hours researching how to hijack a residential property, completely unaware that his research was fundamentally flawed. He was a desperate, bankrupt man playing checkers while I had been playing chess. I looked down at the torn quitclaim deed. Those shredded papers represented the absolute end of my familial obligations. Any lingering guilt or loyalty was extinguished by Gary's proud declaration of war. They were no longer my family. They were hostile invaders actively attempting to steal my wealth to cover their own catastrophic failures. And in the world of financial risk management, hostile invaders are neutralized with extreme prejudice. The sound of Gary's vicious threat hung in the humid air of the living room, completely saturating the space with malice. Brenda broke the silence with a sharp, victorious laugh. She stepped over the shredded remains of the quitclaim deed on the glass table and looked at me with absolute condescension. She told me I had always been entirely too stubborn for my own good, claiming that if I had simply signed the paperwork, we could have avoided this unpleasantness. Now, she declared, I would have to learn the hard way that family always wins. Ashley eagerly jumped into the fray, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of stolen power. She walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows and loudly began discussing her immediate renovation plans. She complained that my coastal minimalist decor was incredibly depressing and lacked any real vision. She announced that since I was legally powerless to evict them, she was going to hire a luxury interior designer by the end of the week. She wanted to tear out my custom mahogany shelving and replace my carefully curated art pieces with flashy, ostentatious mirrors to better suit Jamal's executive brand. She turned to me, offering a sickly sweet smile, and suggested I get comfortable in my subterranean dungeon because the upper levels were strictly reserved for people actively contributing to the family legacy. Jamal chuckled from his position behind the sofa, adjusting his fake gold watch. He advised me to stop fighting the inevitable. He claimed my little temper tantrum with the paperwork was completely meaningless because the law was firmly on their side. He told me to go back downstairs and stay out of the way while he handled real business. I absorbed every single word of their psychological warfare. My face remained an impenetrable mask of blank submission. I did not raise my voice, and I did not offer a single word of rebuttal. I let my shoulders droop slightly, giving them the exact physical response they craved. They needed to see a broken, defeated woman who had finally realized she was completely outmatched. My silence was the ultimate validation of their perceived legal victory. They looked at each other with profound satisfaction, fully believing they had successfully bullied me into surrendering my $1.2 million sanctuary. Without a word, I turned my back on my parents, my sister, and her fraudulent husband. I left the torn pieces of the quitclaim deed resting on the coffee table as a monument to their arrogance. I walked slowly down the hallway, my footsteps echoing against the hardwood floors. Behind me, I could hear Ashley already loudly debating color swatches, and Jamal resuming his fake investor calls, their voices thick with the absolute certainty of their triumph. I reached the heavy steel door of my basement retreat. I stepped inside, pulled the door shut, and engaged the deadbolt with a loud, satisfying click. The moment the lock engaged, the defeated posture vanished completely. I straightened my spine, rolling my shoulders back, as the cold, calculating energy of my Wall Street training surged through my veins. The air in my command center was crisp and heavily air-conditioned, a sharp contrast to the suffocating toxicity upstairs. I dropped into my ergonomic chair and woke my 3 glowing monitors. I opened my encrypted communication channel and initiated a secure video call. Harrison answered on the first ring, sitting in his immaculate New York office, looking sharp and entirely ready for war. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I looked directly into the camera and offered a cold, predatory smile. I told him Gary had just played the squatter rights card. Harrison let out a low, rumbling laugh that vibrated through the speakers. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk. He asked me if they had any idea about the commercial zoning designation. I shook my head, confirming they were completely oblivious. They had spent weeks researching standard residential eviction delays, banking everything on laws designed to protect vulnerable tenants. They had absolutely no clue that I had registered this entire estate as a commercial corporate entity. We spent the next hour methodically finalizing the ultimate destruction protocol. I transferred the massive, heavily encrypted dossier I had compiled over the past 2 weeks directly to Harrison's secure server. He opened the files, his eyes scanning the pristine evidence of Jamal's sweeping financial crimes. He reviewed the fake property rental listings, the unauthorized wire transfers, the forged deeds, and the extensive logs of federal identity theft. Harrison confirmed the evidence was a prosecutor's absolute dream. Jamal had handed us a direct, undeniable path to a lengthy federal prison sentence. Harrison then pulled up the emergency commercial injunction we had prepared. Since my family was claiming residency in a commercially zoned corporate facility, they were not legal tenants. They were committing commercial trespass. Harrison explained that a commercial eviction did not take 6 months. It required a simple police dispatch and could be executed in less than an hour. He had the injunction signed, sealed, and ready to hand to the local authorities the moment I gave the green light. I instructed Harrison to hold the injunction for exactly 48 hours. My surveillance feeds had intercepted digital invitations Jamal and Ashley sent out earlier that afternoon. They were hosting a massive networking event at my house this weekend, inviting dozens of wealthy potential victims to pitch Jamal's fake platform. They wanted an audience to witness their stolen luxury. I decided I would give them exactly the audience they desired. I would let them stand at the peak of their arrogance before I severed the foundation. I ended the call smiling coldly at my glowing monitors. The legal trap they thought they had so carefully constructed around me was actually a steel cage they had permanently locked themselves inside. They had handed me the key, and I was going to drop it straight into the ocean. The next 48 hours felt like the calm before a devastating hurricane. I remained sealed inside my basement command center, watching the monitors as my family frantically transformed my serene coastal property into a tacky corporate showroom. Catering vans began arriving early Saturday morning. Workers hauled heavy tables, expensive floral arrangements, and crates of premium liquor across my pristine lawns. Jamal had clearly spared no expense, likely draining the very last drops of the fraudulent deposits he had scammed from the fake rental listings. He was throwing a desperate, lavish spectacle to create the ultimate illusion of success. By early evening, the driveway was packed with high-end vehicles. Dozens of wealthy potential investors, local socialites, and affluent neighbors. My parents had somehow conned into attending, began pouring through my front door. From my glowing screens, the party looked like a grotesque parody of high society. The caterers circulated with silver trays of champagne and expensive hors d'oeuvres. A string quartet had been set up near the infinity pool, their classical music floating over the crashing waves. The sheer audacity of using my sanctuary to host a criminal event was staggering, but I watched with cold precision. Jamal was the absolute center of attention. He stood on the massive mahogany deck illuminated by the expensive outdoor lighting I had meticulously chosen just months prior. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo that screamed new money and desperation. I turned up the audio feed on my central monitor, listening closely as he pitched his vaporware artificial intelligence company to a circle of older, wealthy men. He threw out ridiculous revenue projections and promised exponential returns, gesturing expansively at the ocean view. He boldly claimed that purchasing this estate was a drop in the bucket compared to his profits. Ashley was right by his side, playing the role of the devoted, wildly successful tech wife. She wore a sparkling designer gown and held a crystal champagne flute, laughing too loudly at every joke Jamal made. She glided through the crowd, accepting compliments on the house architecture and the stunning coastal decor. Whenever a guest praised the interior design, Ashley proudly took full credit, claiming she had spent months curating the perfect aesthetic for their new corporate retreat. She did not hesitate to lie straight to their faces, seamlessly absorbing my hard work as her own personal triumph. But it was Brenda who truly elevated the psychological warfare to a sickening new level. I switched the audio channel to the living room camera, where my mother was holding court with a group of affluent older women. Brenda wore an air of aristocratic superiority, sipping her wine and gesturing toward the vaulted ceilings. She proudly announced that her brilliant son-in-law had purchased this spectacular beach house entirely in cash. She bragged about Jamal's immense intellect and Ashley's perfect marriage, weaving a fictional narrative of ultimate family success. Then one of the guests politely asked if Brenda had any other children. The audio feed picked up my mother's heavy theatrical sigh. She lowered her voice into a tone of mock devastation and fake maternal pity. She told the wealthy strangers that she did have an older daughter named Cassidy. She painted a pathetic picture describing me as a struggling, unemployed spinster who had completely failed at a basic corporate job in New York. Brenda shook her head sadly, claiming that my mental health had deteriorated so badly that I could not even maintain a simple apartment. The lies flowed from her mouth with terrifying ease. Brenda proudly declared that Jamal and Ashley, out of the goodness of their hearts, had taken pity on me. She told the horrified guests that they had graciously allowed me to live rent-free in their basement just so I would not end up homeless on the streets. She called me a tragic burden, a warning tale of what happens when a woman fails to secure a husband and overestimates her own intelligence. The women gasped in sympathy, praising Brenda and Jamal for their incredible family loyalty and boundless charity. I sat in the cool, dark basement listening to my own mother assassinate my character to a room full of strangers. She was actively using my supposed failures to elevate Jamal's fake status. The arrogance was absolutely suffocating. They were drinking my wine, standing on my hardwood floors, and using my wealth to build a prison of lies around me. They firmly believed they had completely conquered me, They thought I was cowering below them, too broken and humiliated to ever show my face or defend my honor. Gary was equally complicit. I watched him on the exterior camera standing by the outdoor fire pit with a premium cigar clamped between his teeth. He was laughing deeply with a group of investors, acting as the proud patriarch who oversaw this entire empire of success. He clapped Jamal on the shoulder, calling him the son he always wanted. Gary was reveling in the stolen glory, completely ignoring the fact that his own house had just been foreclosed on by the bank. He was hiding his absolute financial ruin behind my beachfront property, treating my home like a shield against his failures. The family was entirely convinced they were untouchable. They had successfully bullied me into submission, established their fake residency, and were now utilizing my assets to trap their next round of financial victims. The music swelled upstairs and the party reached a fever pitch of arrogant celebration. I did not feel a single ounce of sadness or betrayal. I had long since accepted that these people were incapable of genuine love. I slowly stood up from my ergonomic chair and smoothed the fabric of my clothes. I reached over and deliberately disconnected the audio feeds, silencing their lies. I turned away from the monitors and walked toward the heavy steel door. The time for silent observation was officially over. I bypassed the casual coastal wear I had lived in for the past month. The defeated daughter they thought they had conquered was completely gone. The Wall Street risk analyst stared back, entirely ready to execute the final maneuver. I climbed the stairs with slow, deliberate precision, the click of my stilettos masked by the loud chatter and clinking champagne glasses above. I headed straight for the smart home control hub. Jamal was standing directly in front of the massive flat-screen television mounted over the fireplace. He stood holding a glass of champagne surrounded by wealthy investors. Brenda was standing nearby, nodding enthusiastically and clinging to the arm of an affluent local socialite. Gary laughed loudly on the deck. I placed my hand flat against the biometric scanner. The system instantly recognized my primary administrative override. I seized total control. First, I targeted the audio matrix. I instantly severed the connection to the string quartet outside and the ambient music playing inside. The sudden absolute silence hit the room like a physical shockwave. Conversations abruptly died. Dozens of heads snapped around in confusion. Before anyone could ask a single question, I executed the second command. I overrode the living room television. His flashy corporate logo vanished instantly, replaced by the glaring white background of my encrypted presentation deck. I stepped out of the shadows and walked directly into the center of the expansive living room. The sharp, authoritative strike of my heels against the hardwood floor echoed loudly in the dead silence. The crowd parted instinctively, sensing the sudden shift in power. I stopped right next to the fireplace, turning to face the sea of confused, wealthy guests. Brenda dropped her wineglass. It shattered against the floor, splashing red wine across the pristine rug. Ashley let out a terrified gasp, covering her mouth. Jamal froze completely, his charismatic smile morphing into absolute panic. "Welcome to my home," I announced. My voice was calm, projecting with a trained corporate authority that easily carried to the back of the room. I noticed my mother earlier introducing me to some of you as her unemployed, mentally unstable daughter who lives in the basement out of charity. Allow me to properly introduce myself. My name is Cassidy. I am the sole legal owner of this $1.2 million estate. I spent the last 10 years working as a senior financial risk analyst on Wall Street, specifically specializing in dismantling corporate fraud. A wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the crowd. The investors standing next to Jamal took a collective step backward, their eyes darting between him and me. I raised a small remote control in my right hand and clicked the forward button. The television screen illuminated the room with the first piece of undeniable evidence. It was a high-resolution scan of the foreclosure notice for my parents' suburban home, complete with the eviction mandate and negative balance statements. "The people hosting you tonight are not wealthy philanthropists," I stated, gesturing toward Gary and Brenda, who were staring at the screen in horror. "My parents did not sell their home to fund this. They were forcibly evicted exactly 2 days before they invaded my property. They are bankrupt." I clicked the remote. The screen transitioned to a display of his personal and business banking ledgers. The balances were highlighted in bright, glaring red. This brings us to our visionary host. I continued my gaze, locking onto Jamal. He claims to be launching a revolutionary artificial intelligence platform. However, as you can clearly see on the screen behind him, his primary operating accounts have a zero balance. His credit cards are severely overdrawn. He is currently dodging multiple debt collection agencies. Jamal scrambled forward, frantically waving his hands at the investors. "Do not listen to her," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "She is insane. This is a targeted smear campaign. She hacked my devices." I ignored his pathetic outburst and clicked the remote for the third time. The screen shifted to the most devastating evidence of all. It displayed the heavily encrypted wire transfer logs, the offshore shell company routing numbers, and the fake luxury rental listings featuring my exact property. "Jamal is not building a software company," I explained, looking directly into the eyes of the lead investor. "He is running a sophisticated textbook Ponzi scheme." The seed money he collected from previous investors was entirely funneled into these offshore accounts to fund his designer suits and luxury car leases. When those funds inevitably ran dry, he convinced my father to take out a $500,000 home equity line of credit to keep the illusion alive. My father lost every single penny, resulting in the foreclosure you just saw. The room was entirely paralyzed. The wealthy guests stared at the screen, their mouths hanging open, as they processed the magnitude of the deception. But Jamal did not stop there, I added, raising my voice, to cut through his frantic, stammering denials. "To fund this specific party tonight, and to secure the capital you were about to hand him, he listed my private home on luxury vacation platforms. He fraudulently claimed to be the legal owner and collected massive, non-refundable summer deposits from innocent families. He used those stolen wire transfers to buy the champagne you are currently drinking." I stood my ground, watching the complete and utter destruction of their arrogant facade. Jamal was sweating profusely, backing away from the angry glares of the very men he had just tried to scam. Ashley was backing toward the hallway, trying to distance herself from her husband. Brenda was shaking uncontrollably, realizing that her entire social standing had just been violently incinerated in front of her affluent peers. Gary pushed his way through the crowd from the deck, his face flushed with rage, but the damage was already permanently inflicted. I had taken their precious stage, ripped down the curtain, and exposed the rotting foundation. Checkmate. The absolute finality of that single word hung in the air for only a fraction of a second before the entire room descended into utter chaos. The lead investor, a silver-haired man, who had been nodding along to Jamal's pitch just moments prior, slammed his champagne flute down onto a side table with enough force to crack the delicate crystal. He turned his back on my brother-in-law and marched straight toward the front door. This action served as the ultimate catalyst. The illusion of wealth and exclusivity instantly evaporated, replaced by the terrifying realization that they were all active participants in a sprawling criminal enterprise. The remaining investors immediately followed his lead. They scrambled to gather their spouses, grabbing expensive coats and designer clutches, rushing toward the exit with frantic urgency. They treated the house like a sinking ship, desperate to physically distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of a federal fraud case. Brenda reached out desperately, grabbing the elbow of the affluent socialite she had been trying to impress all evening. She pleaded with the woman, promising that this was all a terrible misunderstanding and that her daughter was simply experiencing a severe mental breakdown. The socialite yanked her arm out of my mother's grasp as if she had just been touched by a carrier of a deadly plague. She shot Brenda a look of pure, unadulterated disgust, gathered her silk shawl, and joined the mass exodus. The driveway quickly turned into a chaotic traffic jam of luxury vehicles, aggressively backing out and speeding away into the coastal night. The beautiful string quartet musicians on the deck, realizing the event was imploding, hastily packed their expensive instruments into their velvet-lined cases and slipped out the side gate. Within 3 minutes, the lavish corporate networking event was completely annihilated. Jamal was having a spectacular, highly visible meltdown. He lunged toward the fireplace, his polished veneer entirely shattered. He scrambled onto the stone hearth, his hands desperately clawing at the cables behind the massive flat-screen television. He was trying to disconnect the power, frantically attempting to kill the glaring display of his financial crimes. He ripped a thick black HDMI cord straight out of the drywall, tearing away chunks of white plaster in his blind panic. The screen finally went black, but the damage was irreversible. He turned around his chest, heaving his custom-tailored tuxedo rumpled and covered in white plaster dust. He pointed a trembling finger at me, screaming that I had ruined his life, that I had destroyed his one chance to build a billion-dollar empire. His voice cracked, losing its deep authoritative resonance, exposing the terrified bankrupt fraudster hiding underneath. Ashley stood frozen near the hallway, pressing her hands against her ears as if she could physically block out the collapse of her stolen reality. Gary finally broke through the remnants of the fleeing crowd. His face was contorted into a mask of absolute violent rage. He stomped across the hardwood floor, closing the distance between us until he was standing mere inches from my face. He expected me to shrink back, to cower under his imposing physical presence, just like I had done when I was a teenager. I stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight, my eyes locked dead onto his. I did not blink. I did not step back. I let him see the absolute emptiness of my regard for him. Gary raised his hand, his finger jabbing furiously toward my face. He roared that I had crossed the ultimate line, that I was a vindictive, jealous failure trying to drag my successful sister down to my pathetic level. When his screaming failed to generate even a flinch of fear from me, Gary reached into his jacket pocket. He yanked out his smartphone and aggressively punched in 3 numbers. He held the phone to his ear, glaring at me with a look of supreme, arrogant triumph. He thought he was about to play his masterstroke. He loudly announced to the emergency dispatcher that he needed immediate police assistance at our address. He dropped his voice into a tone of manufactured desperate concern, playing the role of the victimized patriarch to absolute perfection. He told the operator that his mentally unstable daughter had broken into the house and was aggressively harassing the legal tenants. He claimed I was having a violent psychotic episode, that I was threatening the safety of his family, and that I was trying to illegally evict them from a property where they had firmly established legal residency. He specifically used the phrase squatter rights, loudly demanding that the authorities dispatch officers immediately to physically remove a dangerous trespasser from the premises. He ended the call, shoving the phone back into his pocket. He crossed his arms over his chest and smirked fully, believing he had just weaponized the local police force against me. He told me I was going to leave this house in handcuffs. I stood perfectly still in the center of the devastated living room. The catering trays were abandoned, half-empty champagne glasses littered the tables, and my family was huddled together, breathing heavily, bracing for the police to arrive and save them. Brenda wrapped her arms around Ashley, while Jamal slumped against the wall, running his hands nervously over his shaved head. They were all looking at me with a mixture of hatred and smug satisfaction. They truly believed Gary's phone call was the ultimate checkmate. They thought the police would walk through the front door, listen to the wealthy older man claiming tenant rights, and drag me out into the cold night. They were completely oblivious to the legal realities of their situation. Gary had not called the authorities to save his family. He had just called them to expedite his own eviction. I did not argue with him. I did not try to explain the colossal mistake he had just made. I simply crossed my arms, offered him a small, chillingly polite smile, and waited for the flashing red and blue lights to illuminate my driveway. Gary had just handed me the final necessary component to execute their complete destruction. He had invited the law into my commercial trap. All I had to do was stand perfectly still and let them walk right into it. The flashing red and blue lights pierced the large living room windows, casting harsh, rotating shadows against the expensive coastal decor. 2 police cruisers had pulled into my crushed gravel driveway, their sirens cutting off abruptly as the officers stepped out into the humid night air. I remained perfectly still by the fireplace, watching them walk up the porch steps. Gary immediately sprang into action. He shoved his way past Jamal and Ashley to reach the front door first. He threw it open, his face twisted into a mask of desperate manufactured concern. He greeted the two uniformed officers with a frantic wave, ushering them into the foyer while launching into a perfectly rehearsed performance. He pointed a trembling finger directly at me, warning the officers that I was highly unstable and unpredictable. He claimed I had violently barged into their peaceful residence, disrupted a crucial business gathering, and was actively threatening the safety of his family. Gary puffed out his chest, stepping squarely in front of Brenda to play the protective patriarch. He confidently informed the lead officer that he and his family had been living at this address for over 14 days. He stated loudly that they had forwarded all their official mail here, establishing clear and undeniable residency under state law. He crossed his arms and demanded that the officers arrest me for harassment and illegal eviction practices, boldly citing his completely absurd squatter rights. Brenda immediately joined the theatrical display. She stepped out from behind Gary, clutching a tissue and wiping away non-existent tears. She told the officers that my mental health had severely deteriorated after I lost my job on Wall Street. She claimed they had generously taken me in, allowing me to live in their basement out of pure parental charity, and this hostile outburst was my way of thanking them. Ashley nodded vigorously, wrapping her arms around herself to appear small and frightened. Jamal stood near the hallway, keeping a safe distance, but adding fabricated details about how my violent entry had terrified his wealthy investors and ruined his corporate networking event. They wove a seamless, unified web of absolute malicious lies, entirely convinced that their collective word would instantly overpower my own solitary defense. The lead officer, a tall man with a stern expression, held up his hand to silence the chaotic chorus of my family. He pulled out a small notepad and took a deliberate step toward me. He asked for my name and my version of the events. He told me that Gary was claiming legal tenancy and warned me that domestic disputes involving established residents usually required civil court intervention, not immediate police removal. Gary smiled triumphantly at that statement, shooting me a look of pure venomous satisfaction. He truly believed he had successfully trapped me in an endless bureaucratic nightmare. I did not raise my voice, nor did I display a single ounce of the frantic energy consuming my family. I slowly reached down to the Italian leather briefcase resting near my feet. I unclasped the brass locks with a sharp click and pulled out a pristine, sealed legal folder. I walked confidently across the hardwood floor and handed the heavy stack of documents directly to the lead officer. I advised him to carefully review the top 3 pages before proceeding with any false assumptions regarding residential tenancy laws. The officer opened the folder, pulling a small flashlight from his tactical vest to illuminate the crisp, legally binding text. As his eyes scanned the highlighted paragraphs, I turned my attention back to Gary. The smug satisfaction on my father's face began to waver, replaced by a tiny flicker of creeping uncertainty. He had expected me to scream, to cry, or to fiercely argue with the police officers. My cold, calculated silence was deeply unsettling to his narcissistic need for control. I addressed the room, my voice echoing clearly against the vaulted ceilings. I explained that Gary had spent hours researching how to hijack a house, but his legal strategy possessed a catastrophic foundational flaw. I stated that squatter rights and standard tenancy laws apply strictly to residential properties. I took a slow step forward, ensuring my words landed with absolute devastating precision. As a risk analyst, I protect my assets, I announced. I purchased this entire property under a blind LLC. It is registered, taxed, and zoned exclusively as a commercial corporate retreat. The lead officer handed the pristine legal folder back to me. He turned his attention entirely to my father, Gary, and Jamal. He squared his shoulders, his hand resting casually on his utility belt. He stated clearly that I was entirely correct. Residential tenancy laws do not apply here. He informed my father that by occupying a commercially zoned corporate facility without an active commercial lease, they were officially committing commercial trespass. He pointed directly toward the front door. You have exactly 1 hour to vacate the premises, or you will all be immediately arrested. The words struck my family like a physical blast. The color instantly drained from Gary's face, leaving him looking hollow. His entire posture collapsed. The loud patriarch who had threatened to sue me just moments ago was gone. He stared at the police officer in absolute disbelief, his mind struggling to comprehend how his brilliant legal loophole had morphed into an immediate criminal charge. Brenda let out a genuine sob. She grabbed Gary's arm, fingers digging into his jacket. She pleaded with him to fix the situation, unable to accept that her reign had crashed into an immovable wall of federal zoning laws. Ashley began to hyperventilate. She looked wildly around the living room, realizing that her grand renovation plans and her stolen luxury lifestyle were evaporating right before her eyes. She turned to me, her face twisted in rage and terror. She screamed that it was physically impossible for them to pack an entire moving truck in 60 minutes. She demanded more time, claiming she had thousands of dollars in expensive designer clothing upstairs that could not be hastily shoved into trash bags. The secondary officer simply crossed his arms and told her she had 58 minutes left. Jamal was completely paralyzed. The charismatic tech facade had melted away. He looked out the front windows, watching the police lights reflect off cars abandoned by fleeing investors. He realized that not only was he losing his fake corporate headquarters, but his entire fraudulent networking event had been thoroughly dismantled in front of the very people he needed to scam. He had no money, no investors, and now no shelter. He turned to Gary, silently begging for a bailout, but my father simply looked away, utterly defeated. The reality of their absolute bankruptcy finally set in. They had no home to return to. Gary's sprawling estate belonged to the bank. Jamal's accounts were completely overdrawn. They had no cash for a hotel, and their wealthy friends had just witnessed their spectacular public humiliation. They were entirely destitute, facing immediate homelessness in the dead of night. Gary turned back to me. The malice in his eyes was replaced by a pathetic pleading. He took a hesitant step forward, hands up in surrender. He begged me to reconsider. He told me that they were my flesh and blood, that turning them out onto the street was an act of unforgivable cruelty. He promised they would follow my rules, that they would pay rent once Jamal secured his funding, and that we could function as a real family again. I looked at the man who had forced me to empty my college savings. I looked at the mother who had called me a tragic burden to strangers. I looked at the sister who had tossed my belongings into the hallway, and the brother-in-law who had tried to steal my home. I felt absolutely nothing for them. I told Gary that blood stopped mattering the moment they decided to use me as a financial shield. I reminded him that he had threatened to make my life hell just an hour ago. I pointed toward the staircase and told him his time was rapidly running out. Panic finally overrode their shock. The instinct for self-preservation kicked in. Ashley let out a frustrated scream and sprinted toward the master suite, her heels clattering against the wood. Brenda followed closely behind, sobbing hysterically. Gary and Jamal scrambled toward the front door, frantically discussing how they could rent a cheap storage unit or find a budget motel that accepted maxed-out credit cards. The living room became a chaotic blur of panicked movement. They grabbed their coats, fake designer bags, and whatever loose items they could easily carry. The officers stood firmly in the foyer, watching the frantic scramble, ensuring that my family did not damage my property or steal my belongings. I remained perfectly still by the fireplace, my posture relaxed, observing their pathetic retreat. The magnificent corporate trap I had built was functioning absolutely flawlessly. I had successfully excised the toxic tumor from my life, using logic, documentation, and the sheer power of the law. But the long night was far from over. Gary and Jamal grabbed the first load of packed suitcases and dragged them out onto the front porch. The coastal wind whipped around them as they moved toward their luxury SUV. They were desperately trying to load their belongings before the police officers decided their hour was up. I watched through the large glass windows as Gary reached for the trunk handle. Suddenly, the crunch of heavy tires echoed loudly across the property. The sound was aggressive, distinct from the departure of the fleeing investors. The flashing lights of the local police cruisers were overwhelmed by the blinding glare of intense headlights sweeping across my front lawn. Gary and Jamal froze, dropping their suitcases onto the stones. 3 massive, unmarked black SUVs tore up the driveway in a synchronized formation. They moved with military precision, their heavy frames blocking the exit and completely boxing in my family's vehicle. The vehicles slammed to a halt, their powerful engines rumbling in the dark. The doors of the lead SUV swung open simultaneously. My family stood paralyzed in the harsh glare of headlights. They thought the local police eviction was the absolute worst scenario. They had absolutely no idea that the real devastating federal consequences were just arriving. Men and women in tactical gear and dark windbreakers stepped out of the unmarked vehicles. The bold yellow letters across their backs clearly read, FBI and financial crimes. The local police officers standing on my porch lowered their hands, recognizing the federal jurisdiction taking over the chaotic scene. Gary dropped his heavy suitcase onto the driveway, the loud thud echoing across the property. His mouth hung open in absolute shock as he watched the agents swarm the property. Jamal took a sudden step backward, bumping hard into the side of his leased SUV. The arrogant swagger he had carried for years vanished, replaced by raw, unadulterated fear. The lead federal agent, a tall woman with a severe expression, walked directly up to Jamal. She did not ask for his identification or offer polite greetings. She simply stated his full legal name and coldly informed him that he was the primary target of an active federal investigation. Jamal tried to put up his trembling hands in a frantic, placating gesture. He stammered, attempting to summon his usual charismatic tech entrepreneur persona to talk his way out. He claimed there was a massive misunderstanding that his legal team would quickly sort it out. The lead agent ignored his pathetic performance completely, her face remaining entirely stoic. She signaled for 2 agents to secure him by the vehicle, while she and 3 others marched straight up the porch steps, flashing their federal badges as they entered my home. I was waiting for them in the center of the living room. Brenda and Ashley had just come down the staircase, their arms full of designer bags, completely oblivious to the massive federal raid unfolding outside. They stopped dead in their tracks, paralyzed by confusion when they saw the agents walking into the house. The lead agent approached me, confirming my legal name and acknowledging the massive digital dossier my private lawyer had securely transmitted to their cybercrimes division. I nodded, maintaining my absolute calm composure. Ashley looked at me, her face pale with rising terror, and demanded to know what I had done to her husband. I turned to my sister, my voice echoing clearly in the suddenly silent room. I told her I did not do anything, and I explained that her husband had dug his own inescapable federal grave. I walked toward the front door, gesturing for my terrified family to follow me outside. We stepped out onto the porch where Jamal was securely surrounded by federal agents. He was sweating profusely, his eyes darting around wildly for an escape route that absolutely did not exist. I looked down at him from the top of the stairs and delivered the final devastating blow. I told the entire family that while I was confined to the basement, I did not just track his pathetic cryptocurrency Ponzi scheme. I dug much deeper into his heavily encrypted network traffic to uncover his ultimate betrayal. I revealed the absolute worst of his financial crimes. Jamal had not just stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from Gary and his angry, defrauded investors. He had actively stolen my identity. I explained that I found massive federal loan applications hidden deep on his unsecured hard drive. Jamal had used my pristine credit score, my Wall Street financial history, and the commercial zoning of my Hilton Head estate to fraudulently apply for massive Small Business Administration loans. He was attempting to siphon federal funds to cover his mounting debts, completely destroying my financial identity in the process. Gary let out a choked gasp, finally understanding the terrifying scope of his son-in-law's criminality. I looked directly into Jamal's panicked, bloodshot eyes. I told him that the very moment he submitted those fraudulent federal applications using my wireless network, my software had captured every single keystroke. I did not just save the files to a local drive. I securely routed the IP logs, the encrypted network packets, and the forged financial documents directly to the federal authorities. I handed them a perfectly wrapped, undeniable prosecution file that left no room for legal maneuvering. By trying to steal my identity to save his sinking ship, he had committed massive federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. The local police could only evict him for commercial trespassing, but the FBI was here to put him in a federal penitentiary for a very long time. The lead agent stepped forward and firmly grabbed Jamal, twisting him to face the vehicle. She recited his Miranda rights, her voice cold over the sound of the ocean waves. She listed the severe charges, emphasizing that each carried mandatory prison sentences. The reality of his destruction finally shattered Jamal's mind. The fake billionaire facade crumbled, leaving nothing but a coward. He fell to his knees on the gravel, sobbing like a frightened child. The loud tech mogul was reduced to a weeping criminal begging for mercy. He pleaded with the agents to listen to him, offering to cooperate and surrender his remaining assets. He begged Gary to call a defense lawyer to save him from federal custody. He screamed for Ashley to help him, promising he would make it all better if she just gave him one more chance. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked loudly around his wrists, sealing his permanent fate. The agents hauled him roughly to his feet, ignoring his pathetic cries. They dragged him aggressively toward the open back door of a waiting black SUV. Ashley collapsed against the wooden porch railing, screaming her husband's name as he was violently shoved into the back of the federal vehicle. Gary stood completely frozen, staring blindly at the flashing lights, his entire world utterly incinerated. Brenda covered her face with trembling hands, weeping hysterically as she realized the man she proudly boasted about was a convicted felon. I stood perfectly still on my porch and watched the doors of the federal vehicle slam shut. I felt absolutely nothing but the cold, pure satisfaction of total victory. As the federal SUVs disappeared down the coastal road, the temporary silence was instantly shattered by the ugly sounds of self-preservation. The family front completely evaporated. Ashley was the first to pivot. She spun around and began screaming frantically at the local police officers who were still standing in the driveway. She waved her hands, declaring she had absolutely no idea her husband was a criminal. She threw Jamal entirely under the bus, claiming he kept all his financial dealings hidden, and she was completely just another innocent victim of his manipulation. She completely ignored that she gleefully helped him spend the stolen money. Her loyalty to her supposed billionaire husband vanished the exact second his wealth was exposed as a lie. Gary and Brenda were watching the entire scene with hollow, sunken eyes. The reality of their total financial and social ruin had finally crushed them. They turned away from their screaming golden child and slowly walked back toward the porch steps. The arrogant patriarch who confidently threatened to sue me was gone. Gary collapsed onto his knees right on the crushed gravel of my driveway. Brenda fell right beside him. The pristine, wealthy image they had meticulously maintained for decades was replaced by the pathetic sight of two desperate predators realizing they had no host left to drain. My father looked up at me, tears streaming down his face, and begged for mercy. He pleaded to let them stay in the basement. He cried about family blood and how a daughter could not possibly throw her own parents out onto the street in the middle of the night. He promised they would never ask for another dime, that they would clean the house, that they would do whatever I wanted, if I just showed them a shred of compassion. Brenda reached out with a trembling hand, sobbing hysterically, repeating over and over that they simply had nowhere else to go. I looked down at the two people who had willingly sacrificed my future to protect a fraud. I felt the cool ocean breeze wash over me, clearing away the last remnants of their toxic influence. I did not raise my voice, and I did not flinch at their desperate, pathetic tears. I looked at them with absolute ice in my veins. When you forced me to empty my college savings to cover Ashley's debts, you did not care about blood, I stated, my voice ringing out clearly in the quiet coastal air. When you tried to leave me homeless and steal my sanctuary to fund a criminal, blood did not matter to you at all. You made your choices. You chose the golden child. You chose the fake billionaire. Now you get to live with the consequences of your investments. Get off my property." The local police officers, having witnessed enough of the chaotic display, stepped in to finish the commercial eviction. They instructed my family to gather the suitcases they had dragged onto the driveway and ordered them to start walking. Ashley cried hysterically as an officer directed her away from the house. Gary and Brenda dragged their heavy bags down the long, dark road, their shoulders slumped in total defeat. I stood on the porch and watched them walk away until they disappeared into the shadows. The crushing weight I had carried since childhood vanished with them. Fast forward exactly 6 months. The legal system moved swiftly, dismantling the remnants of my family's fraudulent empire. Jamal was denied bail and quickly accepted a plea deal to avoid a lengthy trial. He is currently serving a 5-year federal prison sentence for wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. His flashy suits have been replaced by a standard prison uniform, and his fake tech startup is nothing but a cautionary tale in federal court records. Ashley avoided criminal charges by cooperating with investigators and testifying against her husband, but her life was entirely destroyed. She filed for bankruptcy and finalized a messy divorce. The golden child who had sneered at my corporate career is now working a minimum wage retail job at a discount clothing store, living in a cramped studio apartment, and constantly dodging calls from angry creditors Jamal left behind. Gary and Brenda experienced the harshest reality check of all. With their suburban mansion repossessed and their savings incinerated, they were forced to relocate to a tiny, low-income apartment complex on the outskirts of their old city. They now rely heavily on government food stamps and strict budgeting just to survive. The wealthy social circle they had so desperately tried to impress completely abandoned them the moment the news of Jamal's arrest and their foreclosure became public knowledge. Their country club memberships were revoked, their phone calls went unanswered, and they are now completely isolated, left alone to reflect on the devastating cost of their arrogance. As for me, I am sitting on the pristine balcony of my commercial corporate retreat. The Atlantic Ocean stretches out endlessly before me, the crashing waves providing a soothing, rhythmic soundtrack to my evening. I take a slow sip of an expensive red wine as the sun sets brilliantly over the water, casting vibrant shades of orange and purple across the sky. The house is completely quiet, heavily fortified, and entirely mine. The deep packet inspection software has been uninstalled, the hidden cameras have been deactivated, and the digital snare has been completely dismantled. I am no longer a warden guarding a prison. I am a woman breathing in the absolute beautiful freedom of a life successfully reclaimed. Family is not defined by shared DNA. It is defined by mutual respect, genuine support, and the boundaries you set to protect your own peace. Sometimes cutting out the cancer is the absolutely only way to save yourself. Have you ever had to use the law to protect yourself from your own relatives? Let me know in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe for more stories today. The story of Cassidy defending her sanctuary against her own parents and sister illuminates a profound and often difficult truth. Shared DNA does not automatically grant someone a free pass to exploit, manipulate, or destroy your peace. For generations, society has relentlessly pushed the narrative that we must endlessly forgive and accommodate our relatives simply because they are blood. However, this harrowing ordeal teaches us that establishing ironclad boundaries is not an act of cruelty, but a fundamental, strict requirement for personal preservation and emotional survival. When individuals who are supposed to protect and nurture you instead view you merely as a financial safety net or a disposable asset, blind loyalty quickly becomes a toxic trap. Her complete transformation from a terrified, compliant teenager into a formidable, independent risk analyst demonstrates that reclaiming your power requires acknowledging harsh realities over wishful thinking. She stopped waiting for the magical moment her parents would finally love her correctly, and instead took decisive, unapologetic action to protect the life and sanctuary she had painstakingly built from the ground up. We often hesitate to enforce strict consequences on our toxic relatives, fearing the crushing guilt or the inevitable social backlash of walking away. Yet, allowing deeply flawed individuals to repeatedly cross your boundaries only enables their destructive behavior while steadily eroding your own mental health and stability. Real family is built on a solid foundation of mutual respect, genuine support, and accountability, not manipulation, extortion, and endless entitlement. Cutting ties with toxic people, even those who share your exact bloodline, is sometimes the absolute only viable path to true freedom and emotional healing. Your personal peace is always worth fiercely defending against any hostile invader. Take charge of your peace today by setting the firm boundaries you have always been afraid to strictly enforce.